There's a moment Sandra Bullock still thinks about, years later, when she's asked about working with Keanu Reeves. It's not from filming Speed. It's not from any premiere or interview or awards ceremony. It's from a quiet Tuesday evening in 1993, in a Korean restaurant in Los Angeles that most people in Hollywood had never heard of, when she watched him do something she still doesn't fully understand. She tells the story carefully, because she knows how it sounds. She knows people expect celebrity anecdotes to be polished, punchlined, ready for late-night television. But this one isn't like that. This one she keeps close, brings out only occasionally, and always with the same uncertain pause at the end, the same trailing question in her voice. "I don't know how he knew," she says. "I still don't know." The restaurant was called Hansol. It occupied the ground floor of a tired building in Koreatown, sandwiched between a laundromat and a shuttered electronics repair shop. The sign outside was in Korean only. There was no English menu. The windows were covered with sun-faded paper, and the door stuck when you pushed it open, scraping against warped linoleum. Sandra had never been there before. Keanu had. They were 3 weeks into pre-production on Speed, still in that early phase where cast members are circling each other, trying to figure out what kind of working relationship they're going to have. The director, Jan de Bont, had introduced them briefly, but they hadn't really talked. Keanu had suggested dinner. Not somewhere flashy. Just somewhere with good food. Sandra remembers being slightly nervous. Not because of him specifically, but because of the situation, new film, new people, that particular Hollywood anxiety of not knowing yet whether you're going to be accepted or frozen out. She was still relatively new to this level of production. Keanu already had Point Break and Bill and Ted behind him. She didn't know what to expect. What she found was a man who drove a beat-up Norton motorcycle, wore the same leather jacket he'd probably owned since high school, and seemed genuinely happy to eat at a place where the tables wobbled and the fluorescent light buzzed overhead. "You've been here before," she said, looking around at the handful of other customers, all Korean, all watching them without watching them. "A few times," he said. "The owner knows my order." The owner was a woman in her late 60s named Mrs. Choi. She emerged from the kitchen when they walked in, wiping her hands on a towel, and her face did something complicated when she saw Keanu, a mixture of recognition, warmth, and something that looked almost like caution. She spoke to him in Korean. Just a few words. Sandra didn't understand them, but she noticed Keanu's response. He answered in Korean too, haltingly, with obvious gaps in vocabulary, but with enough fluency to carry the exchange. Mrs. Choi's expression softened. She touched his arm briefly, then led them to a table in the back corner, away from the window. Sandra watched this interaction with the particular attention that actors develop, the habit of cataloging gestures, reading subtext, filing away human behavior for future use. Something about it felt off. Not wrong, exactly. Just layered in a way she couldn't quite parse. "You speak Korean," she said when they sat down. "A little," Keanu said. "I lived in different places growing up." "You pick things up." He didn't elaborate. Sandra would learn later about his childhood, the multiple countries, the absent father, the constantly shifting ground beneath his feet. But in that moment, she just noted that he didn't seem interested in explaining himself, and she respected that. Mrs. Choi brought them food without taking an order. Small dishes kept appearing: kimchi, namul, japchae, a bubbling pot of jjigae. Keanu thanked her each time, and each time Sandra noticed the same strange tension in the older woman's manner. Gratitude, yes. But something else underneath it. Something worried. They ate. They talked about the script, about the logistics of filming on moving buses, about Jan de Bont's intensity and whether it would be inspiring or exhausting. Keanu was easy to talk to, present, unhurried, genuinely curious about her thoughts. He asked questions and actually listened to the answers. He laughed at her jokes. He made some of his own, mostly self-deprecating. Sandra relaxed into the meal. The food was extraordinary. The conversation was comfortable. She started to think that maybe this film would be okay, that maybe she'd found the right project with the right people. And then the men walked in. There were 4 of them. Well dressed in that particular way that reads as professional but not corporate, tailored suits, expensive watches, no ties. They moved with the ease of people who expected deference, and they got it. The few other diners in the restaurant suddenly became very focused on their own meals. Mrs. Choi appeared from the kitchen, and this time her face showed nothing but careful neutrality. The men took a table near the front. One of them, the oldest, maybe mid-50s, with silver-streaked hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority, glanced toward the back corner where Keanu and Sandra were sitting. His gaze lingered. Sandra felt the temperature in the room shift. She'd grown up in Virginia, not Los Angeles, but she'd been in the industry long enough to recognize when a space had become charged with something unspoken. "Friends of the family?" she asked quietly, trying to keep her tone light. Keanu didn't answer immediately. He was looking at the men, but not in the way you'd look at a potential threat. It was more like he was reading something, a document, a puzzle, a piece of text that required careful attention. "Not exactly," he said finally. His voice was calm, but Sandra noticed that he'd stopped eating. What happened next is the part Sandra has trouble explaining, because it didn't happen all at once. It happened in fragments, in small observations that she only later understood were connected. The first thing she noticed was that Keanu started paying attention to the conversation at the other table. Not obviously eavesdropping, just present to it, aware of it, in the way someone might be aware of background music. The men were speaking Korean, voices low but not secretive. Whatever they were discussing, they weren't hiding it. The second thing she noticed was Mrs. Choi. The older woman kept finding reasons to pass by the men's table, refilling water, adjusting a condiment tray, asking if they needed anything. But she also kept glancing back at Keanu, quick looks that carried some kind of meaning Sandra couldn't interpret. The third thing she noticed was Keanu's hand. It had moved to his pocket, and he was writing something on a small piece of paper, hidden beneath the table edge. Not writing, exactly. More like jotting notes. Quick marks, barely looking down, his attention still apparently focused on Sandra. "What are you doing?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. "Just remembering something," he said. For later. The men stayed for about 40 minutes. They ate, they talked, they laughed occasionally in the clipped way of people conducting business rather than enjoying leisure. The older man, clearly the leader, did most of the talking. The others listened, nodded, occasionally offered responses. Throughout their meal, Keanu maintained his conversation with Sandra. They talked about her family, about his motorcycle, about movies they'd loved and movies they'd barely survived making. He was fully present, fully engaged, or at least he seemed to be. But Sandra had the persistent sense that he was doing 2 things at once, running 2 parallel processes that shouldn't have been possible to maintain simultaneously. When the men finally left, Mrs. Choi appeared at their table almost immediately. She sat down in the empty chair beside Keanu, something Sandra sensed she wouldn't normally do with customers, and spoke to him rapidly in Korean, her voice urgent but controlled. Keanu listened. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out the folded paper he'd been writing on. He smoothed it out on the table and slid it toward her. Sandra saw Korean characters, numbers, what might have been addresses or names. A page of dense, handwritten notes. Mrs. Choi looked at the paper. Her face went still. Then she looked up at Keanu with an expression Sandra would never forget, equal parts disbelief and overwhelming relief, as if he had just handed her a map out of a maze she'd been trapped in for years. She started crying. The next hour is harder to reconstruct, because Sandra was on the outside of something she didn't fully understand. But she pieced together the basic shape of it from what Keanu explained later, haltingly, reluctantly, as if he wasn't sure whether he should be telling her at all. Mrs. Choi's restaurant was a front. Not by choice. Years earlier, her husband had gotten into trouble, a debt, a bad decision, the kind of small mistake that can spiral into an inescapable trap. He'd borrowed money from people who turned out to be connected to a Korean crime organization operating in Los Angeles. When he couldn't pay, they'd taken the restaurant as collateral, but not in any legal sense. In the sense that now they owned it, that they used the back room for meetings, that they laundered money through the books, that Mrs. Choi and her husband were hostages in their own lives. They couldn't go to the police. The organization had made it clear what would happen if they did. They couldn't run. They had nowhere to go, no resources, no connections powerful enough to protect them. So they stayed, and they cooked, and they watched their business become something it was never meant to be. Keanu had learned all of this gradually, over multiple visits, through conversations that Mrs. Choi had probably never intended to be revelations. She trusted him because he was quiet, because he was kind, because he came back again and again and never seemed to want anything except good food and human company. And somewhere along the way, she'd told him enough for him to understand. What he'd done that night, what Sandra had watched without understanding, was decode a business meeting. From fragments of overheard conversation, from names and numbers and references dropped casually by men who assumed no one at the other tables could follow their Korean, Keanu had reconstructed a partial map of the organization's operations. Delivery schedules. Contact names. The address of a warehouse. The structure of a transaction that was clearly illegal. It wasn't complete. It couldn't be. But it was enough. What happens now? Sandra asked, when the restaurant had emptied and Mrs. Choi had finally stopped crying. Keanu was quiet for a long moment. He looked tired, not the kind of tired that comes from physical exhaustion, but the kind that comes from carrying weight you're not sure you're strong enough to bear. "There's a detective," he said finally. LAPD. Korean American. He's been trying to build a case against these guys for years, but he can't get anyone to testify. No one trusts the police enough to come forward. He paused, looking at the paper on the table, the notes he'd taken, the fragments of an operation laid bare. But maybe they don't have to testify. Maybe there's enough here to point the investigation in the right direction. To find physical evidence. Documentation. Things that don't require witnesses. Sandra looked at him, really looked at him, the strange quiet man she'd agreed to make a movie with. "How do you know a detective in LAPD Korean organized crime?" she asked. Keanu almost smiled. "I know a lot of people." The months that followed weren't dramatic in the Hollywood sense. There was no climactic confrontation, no shootout, no triumphant arrest that made the evening news. What there was, instead, was the slow grinding machinery of law enforcement finally getting the leverage it needed. The detective, whose name Sandra never learned, used Keanu's information to obtain warrants. The warrants led to searches. The searches led to evidence. The evidence led to arrests, not all at once but incrementally, a cascade of small victories that eventually amounted to something larger. The organization didn't collapse. Operations like that rarely do. But it contracted, it withdrew, it released its grip on the small businesses and frightened families that had been trapped in its orbit. Mrs. Choi's restaurant became her own again. Legally, genuinely, with no more men in expensive suits holding meetings in the back room. She would run it for another 15 years before retiring, and she would never forget the quiet actor who sat in her corner booth and listened to her story. Sandra Bullock has been asked many times what it was like to work with Keanu Reeves on Speed. She usually gives the expected answer: he was professional, he was prepared, he was kind to the crew. All of which is true. But sometimes, when the interviewer is patient and the moment feels right, she tells the other story. The one about the restaurant. The one about watching a man who could have been anywhere in the world, doing anything, choosing instead to sit in a worn-out chair and listen to a language he'd taught himself just well enough to understand. I think that's who he is, she says, when she reaches the end of the story. Not the action hero. Not the movie star. Just someone who pays attention. Someone who actually sees people. She pauses, considering. I've worked with a lot of talented actors. People who can transform themselves, who can make you believe anything. But I've never met anyone else who could sit through an entire conversation with me, make me feel like the only person in the room, and simultaneously decode a criminal operation happening at the next table over. She shakes her head, still uncertain how to explain it. He wasn't doing it to be a hero. He wasn't doing it for the story. He was just present. To everyone. To everything. And he took what he heard, and he found a way to help. The restaurant is gone now. The building was demolished years ago, replaced by a mixed-use development with a coffee shop on the ground floor. Mrs. Choi passed away in 2018, surrounded by family, in a house she'd finally been able to pay off. Keanu still rides his motorcycle through Koreatown sometimes. He still speaks enough Korean to navigate a menu or exchange pleasantries with shopkeepers. He still notices things that most people miss. And somewhere in LAPD's archives, there's a case file built on evidence that traced back to a single page of handwritten notes, taken in a restaurant that no longer exists, by a man who was supposed to be eating dinner. That's the thing about attention, real attention. The kind that requires you to be fully present while simultaneously tracking patterns and connections that others aren't equipped to see. It's not a superpower. It's not a gift. It's a discipline, practiced over years, refined through a lifetime of watching and listening and caring enough to remember. Keanu Reeves has never claimed to be exceptional. He's spent most of his career deflecting praise, attributing success to luck or collaboration or circumstances beyond his control. He lives simply, rides public transportation, wears the same clothes for years. But the people who've been close to him, who've sat across from him at dinner, who've watched him interact with the world, know that something unusual lies behind those quiet eyes. Not genius in the traditional sense. Not calculating intelligence. Something more like radical presence, an unwillingness to let any moment or person go unnoticed. Sandra Bullock understood this, that night in the restaurant. She'd watched him decode an operation without ever seeming to stop being present with her. She'd seen him transform scattered fragments of overheard conversation into something that could change lives. And she'd realized, sitting there in the aftermath, that she was working with someone who experienced the world differently than most people do. Someone who actually saw. Someone who remembered. Someone who cared enough to do something about it. That's not the kind of story that makes headlines. It's not the kind of heroism that wins awards. It's just a man in a restaurant, paying attention and finding a way to help. But maybe that's the only kind of heroism that really matters.